we do know that the adherence has been highest in older people. Mm-hmm. Now, this, of course, is partly probably because they're at higher risk of infection, and perceived risk is a major driver of behaviour. Young men actually are the least likely to adhere, and older people more likely to adhere.
As we appear to be now officially entering an era where UK police forces will be required to record incidents of hate perceived to be motivated by a person's sex, I thought I'd revisit a relatively obvious example of such that I stumbled across last summer when examining the work of the cross-party Parliamentary Committee on Women and Equalities. It came in the form of a tweet from none less than the committee's current chair, Conservative MP Caroline Noakes, which offered some hilarious health-related advice, suggesting that in the context of a global pandemic, one should avoid men in the workplace and follow women instead. The incident was largely ignored, but it did result in at least one complaint to the House of Commons Ethics Committee, and over 100 direct responses to the MP, advising her that given the high proportions of male COVID fatalities being reported at the time, the joke with a jag was in very poor taste indeed, and suggesting that had a male MP posted something similar about women, there would likely have been media outrage and a mob of angry protesters at their door. To be clear, I am not, and I repeat, not proposing that I or anyone else should start wasting valuable police time by reporting such examples of overt prejudice directed towards men. Furthermore, I'm not proposing that one of Parliament's most prominent champions of people with characteristics protected from discrimination and hate was seriously advocating that people should start avoiding men for the good of their health in the middle of a national health crisis. But nevertheless, from September, such communications will qualify as an incident of hate motivated by sex, and police will be required to record it as such if anyone feels so inclined to complete a quick online form. By way of example, in 2017, a speech on immigration by the then Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, was assessed by the West Midlands Police after an Oxford University professor, who hadn't actually heard it, lodged a complaint alleging that Ms. Rudd had used hate speech. After concluding that no actual crime had actually been committed, the West Midlands Police then diligently recorded the professor's complaint as a non-crime hate incident, in accordance with the Home Secretary's own department's guidelines. And in this video, I'm going to present some edited highlights from a related discussion about health, hygiene and protected people, and I invite you to consider whether or not any aspect of it might also be reasonably perceived as a hate incident. The discussion occurred last June during the fourth and final formal evidence hearing for the Women and Equalities Committee's inquiry into the unequal impact of COVID-19, specifically the impact on people with protected characteristics. I'll leave a link to the entire 2-hour meeting just in case anyone wants to examine the excerpts I'm about to present within their full context. The meeting in question involved the important task of reviewing the government's ability to effectively communicate with different communities and people from diverse backgrounds during a countrywide health crisis. And we begin with a contribution from Labour's Kim Johnson, who recently objected to Conservative MP Ben Bradley's appointment onto the committee by publicly communicating her disdain towards both Mr. Bradley and the woefully marginalised straight white men she perceives him to represent.
This is a question for Lucy. Lucy, as you know, the government has responsibility under the public sector equality duty to ensure all communications are accessible and comprehensible to people with protected characteristics. However, the government messaging on COVID-19 is largely delivered by white, male, middle-aged members of the Cabinet. So there is limited research on which groups were more and less likely to adhere to the government advice. Would you say that improved communications by the government would likely to increase compliance during the pandemic?
Ms. Johnson's concern about certain people's ability, or perhaps more importantly, inability to adhere to guidance issued by mostly white male middle-aged men, continued with an inference in relation to why it is that certain people with certain protected characteristics might be contracting COVID and dying in such disproportionate numbers.
The next question is aimed at you and Ali, and you've just mentioned about certain groups adhering to the guidance, but it's clear that throughout the pandemic that men have been dying at a higher rate than women. So would you say that the government's messaging worked for men?
To be honest, we don't yet know why men are dying at a higher rate. So I would not like to definitely link that to behaviour. And if there is a behavioural link, which there may be, but we don't know yet, it could actually be something like late health seeking rather than poor hygiene practices. It could be poor hygiene practices, and certainly that is an avenue that needs to be pursued. There's also the question of whether men, for example, may have been having to continue to work in higher risk occupations, which some of them were in. So it's a very complex picture. We don't really know enough yet to be quite sure about where we need to take action, but certainly improving sort of self-protective behaviours and protective behaviours towards others is part of the picture, definitely.
Now, in fairness to Kim Johnson, the spread of infection between peoples and subsequent fatalities could absolutely involve poor hygiene practices. And in the middle of a global pandemic, there's no point pussyfooting around that particular fact. And perhaps I'm even reading a little too much into that little smirk at the end of her question. But nevertheless, and not for the first time with this committee, it strikes me that there is a notable shift in nuance between the manner in which men are spoken about when compared to pretty much any other protected group.
And final question to you, Ali, is kind of based on what you've just said, but there are high rates of death from COVID amongst people living in the most deprived areas and those who self-identify as Black. And do you think that the government's messages could have been more targeted to prevent some of those deaths? And do you think it would have had an impact?
Especially when you consider the approach adopted when discussing the ability, or perhaps more importantly, inability of people with protected characteristics to adhere to guidance issued by mostly white middle-aged men.
And this is quite a difficult question to frame. So over the last week or so, we have seen large numbers of predominantly young, not exclusively young, BAME people protesting in large numbers. Have you seen any evidence of the government working to understand how they can best communicate with young, angry people who have every right to protest, how they can protest safely?
Now, I should pause for a moment to acknowledge that any implied criticism about the committee's collective communication style does not extend to the expert witnesses who gave evidence at the meeting. The bulk of the meeting actually involved a relatively informative and constructive discussion about the government's ability to communicate important information to a very diverse population of people with disabilities. That's disabled people who identify as female or male or any other sex, by the way. Indeed, in my humble subjective opinion, the all-female panel of professional experts offered informed and generally objective advice in response to all of the questions put to them by a committee comprised of mostly white middle-class women.
I just wanted to add on that point that from a behavioural point of view, messaging is only one influence on behaviour and not the most important one by any means. And one of our concerns has been that some of these inequality issues are not probably due to messaging at all. They're more to do with the opportunities and resources that are available to different members of the community.
Sadly, the quality of evidence presented throughout the inquiry hasn't always been to a consistent standard. And in previous videos, I've highlighted examples where those perceived to be in positions of authority and experts in their field can also display a quite remarkable blind spot when it comes to the protected characteristic of sex.
We are getting evidence of the disproportionate number of Black, Asian, minority ethnic and people, and also men dying from this virus. It's still emerging. At this point, to what extent is this because of the nature of the virus itself, or is it because of wider social factors? What's your interpretation?
So I think in general, we don't have to think about the nature of the virus. We can probably explain most of the excess on social determinants of health. But what about the doctors?
Yeah.
Now, I can't get my head around that. I don't know. Something like 40% of doctors in the NHS are from BME backgrounds, and 95% of the deaths. Now, I wouldn't imagine doctors are suffering from social disadvantage or poverty, overcrowding, maybe multi-generational households. I don't know why the doctors seem to be at high risk. It's terribly important. I don't think it's readily explicable on the basis of the kind of things that I was talking about. And maybe we'll understand more about this terrible disease if we can explain that.
That was the esteemed Professor Michael Marmot giving evidence earlier in the inquiry, at a time when the media was reporting the possibility that people with Black and minority ethnic characteristics were dying from COVID at twice the rate when compared to people who are white. And the remarkable thing about Professor Marmot's comments were that they revealed that, for some reason, he had failed to comprehend the statistically significant fact that 94% of the doctors who had died also happened to be men, meaning that their sex was clearly as relevant to the matter as their ethnicity and age. In fairness to Professor Marmot, not one single journalist made the connection either, which highlights just how ingrained societal gamma bias towards men really is. And I do actually have a great deal of respect for Michael Marmot's work more generally, which is the exact reason why my jaw nearly hit the floor when later in the same meeting the esteemed professor displayed the quite extraordinary depths of his own ignorance. Marmot's research has focused on the cold reality that the most significant societal detriment impacting on health inequalities in this country is not in fact any of the protected characteristics of concern to the committee, but rather obviously socioeconomic status. So, for example, his research has shown us that men living in the most deprived areas in England can expect to live on average 13 years less than a woman living in the most affluent. A reality that makes his next statement all the more remarkable.
Now, when we turn to COVID-19, is the excess in men because of social disadvantage, or is it, as I've heard biologists speculate, women are more biologically robust, have better immune systems. We know women live longer than men, which I think is biological, not social. I think everything's social, but I don't think that is. I think women live longer than men for biological reasons. And whether that relates to women's relative protection from mortality from COVID-19, I don't know. But I think it's a very important question.
Presumably the committee's ears might have been pricked had the professor insinuated that black men disproportionately die early because, well, that's just the way it is, and as God or nature intends it to be. Indeed, given the outrage at the time about the untimely death of George Floyd in America, such unflinching biological determinism might even have made headline news. But what makes Marmot's literal shrug of the shoulders all the more astounding is that it is widely understood that the leading cause of death for men under 50 in the UK is currently suicide. And we know that social deprivation is a major factor in this phenomenon, and that research by the Samaritans has shown that men in poor neighbourhoods are approximately 10 times more likely to die by suicide than more affluent men. And some of those lives tragically lost so early will indeed have belonged to the sort of woefully marginalised straight white men to whom Ms Johnson has shown so little due regard, and who, in my humble subjective opinion, are currently woefully served by the Government Equalities Office, and indeed technically not officially served at all. Many others will be men from black and minority ethnic backgrounds who disproportionately live in disadvantaged areas. Gay men, disabled men, young men, and men living in Merseyside, which, according to ONS data, has the highest suicide rate in the country. Professor Marmot's blind spot is a powerful illustration of the empathy gap, which is why I think it's worth revisiting, and I also think that it's about time that the committee start listening to the country's most eminent expert on this matter, William Collins, author of The Empathy Gap. Perhaps Mr Bradley will even invite him to appear before the committee, but in the meantime, here's an excerpt from his talk at the 2020 International Conference on Men's Issues, which includes some input on the matter of health, hygiene and people with protected characteristics.
The obvious health issue recently has, of course, been COVID-19. Don't worry, I'm not going to bang on much about that. We've all had enough of it. But it has provided yet another fine illustration of the empathy gap in practice. I've lost track of the number of online discussions, generally many hours long, involving Parliament's Women and Equalities Committee or the Equality and Human Rights Commission, or professors of gerontology and many, many others, endlessly repeating how COVID-19 has affected women most. On the scoreboard of victimhood, dying would seem not to rate highly, not if the dead are men, anyway. I await rigorous multivariate regressions being done, but it's fairly clear that men have about double the probability of dying from COVID-19. The usual feminist culprits have had an excellent opportunity to display their sexist bigotry, publishing articles asserting things like, I quote, "There's plenty of evidence that men aren't so bothered about hand washing and general cleanliness," without citation, obviously. I don't know about viruses, but the evidence regarding bacteria on hands is not that. Here are the results of some published bacteria assays from hand swabs. Graphs on the screen now are from Noah Fiera et al. 2008. They show that the range of different types of bacteria tends to be larger on women's hands than on men's hands. And another study is the 2010 paper by Judah et al., who took hand swabs from members of the public using public transport. Data was gathered at 5 major cities in the UK and concentrated upon bacteria of fecal origin. Data from 3 cities indicated that a greater percentage of women than men had contaminated hands. Data from 2 cities indicated that a greater percentage of men than women had contaminated hands. Overall, there was no significant difference.
Kim Johnson in particular may be interested to know that the latter study found that Liverpool was the city with the second highest incidence of fecal matter, that manual workers were found to have cleaner hands than professionals, and overall women in professional occupations had a higher risk of contamination. All of which brings us full circle to the concept of hate speech or hate incidents, involving the communication of prejudice and ignorance motivated by people's personal protected characteristics, which was a subject that our expert witnesses addressed at the very end of the inquiry's last meeting.
I think there's actually a gap that we haven't talked about, but I think is really relevant, which is a need really for the government to put out messaging in a whole range of ways to prevent and counter hate crime against specific scapegoated communities. That's either online or now, as we are coming out of lockdown, we've been hearing about people being scapegoated. So that's often for spreading COVID-19, whether that's particular communities, Chinese, Muslim, Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities. We've also heard incidences of gay men being assumed to be having HIV and spreaders of HIV, spreaders of COVID. And issues like that happening on the streets and in neighbourhoods. So I think there's an issue to be looked at, how we make sure there isn't further division sown between communities and government messaging communications around that.
And in this context, my question would be, what sort of message should men and the people who love them take from Kim Johnson's inference that they might not be dying of COVID in such large numbers, if only they were capable of following simple hygiene instructions from people in government like her? And why exactly is it that we should avoid men and follow women instead? As Caroline Noakes's critics quite rightly pointed out, in this day and age, you wouldn't get away with overtly directing this sort of ignorance towards any other protected group, certainly not if you're one of Parliament's most prominent equality champions. In fact, such comments could quite literally spark an international incident. And indeed, one of the reasons that I chose to shine a spotlight on this particular inference out of so many, this particular incident of hate, is that some 20 years ago, that's exactly what happened when a pop star said something similar about people from India.
This isn't just about a TV show anymore, it's a major diplomatic row.
I think the Indians want reassured that we are a nation of fairness and we're a nation of tolerance.
She's fucking funny little. Why am I detested? Why am I hated?
The thing that aggravates me with Shilpa, she fingers your food.
Oh, this chicken is fine.
Do they do that in India, eat with the hands? Or is that in China?
I'm not sure, I don't like all that though. They put finger
I
in
don't
my
know where their
food.
fingers have been.
That's why they're all thin, because they're sick all the time.
The reaction here in Mumbai, the Indian film industry's capital, is one of outrage.
Oh my God.
In fairness to the members of the Women and Equalities Committee, as their very name implies, such institutional sexism is by now so well embedded into public service provision that the remit of the Government Equalities Office that the committee exists to oversee is presently limited only to inequalities impacting on women and girls. Presumably this goes at least some way to explaining why the outcome of an inquiry into a disease killing more men by a ratio of 2-to-1, conducted by a committee comprised mostly of white middle-class women, was to recommend further inquiries into how pre-existing inequalities have impacted on people like Kim Johnson's vulnerability to the virus, and the economic impact of a national crisis on people who predominantly look a lot like them. But it is of course also another stark illustration of the empathy gap in action. It's the reason why I support the campaign for a Minister for Men, and why I would encourage you to write to your Member of Parliament on that matter using the links provided. Because in an era where we have now witnessed a Member of Parliament openly advocate for a gender-specific 6 p.m. curfew, I for one think it's important to acknowledge that woefully marginalised straight, white, working-class men, and men of all shades and sexualities, get their hands dirty for their families and their communities every single hour and day of the week, often in order to undertake some of the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs required to keep this country's lights and life support machines switched on.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.